This is Apropos. With efforts to end the war in the Middle East at an impasse, Donald Trump is expected to receive a briefing this Thursday on plans for fresh military strikes on Tehran as part of an American drive to compel the Islamic Republic to return to the negotiating table. It comes as the Iranian Supreme Leader vowed in a statement read on TV to protect the Islamic Republic's nuclear and missile capabilities and again reasserted Tehran's control over the Strait of Hormuz. With the latest, here's Cara Scarland.
This footage, released by Iranian state television, apparently shows ships anchored in the Strait of Hormuz. It paints the picture of an ongoing stalemate over the waterway, crucial for oil and gas shipments. Iran is insisting on enforcing a closure for international shipping, while the United States continues its naval blockade of Iranian ports. On Thursday, Iran's new Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, said a new chapter was unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz.
We and our neighbors across the waters of the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman share a common destiny. Foreigners who come from thousands of kilometers away to act with greed and malice there have no place in it, except at the bottom of its waters.
Khamenei's words came in the form of a written statement read out on state television. The Supreme Leader was wounded in the initial US-Israeli strikes that killed his father, Ali Khamenei, and has not been seen in public since. According to the US, he is disfigured and severely injured. Washington has rejected Iran's offer to open the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for lifting the US blockade, hoping to squeeze the Islamic Republic's oil industry by halting exports and force Tehran to be more flexible in negotiations. Iran's parliament speaker and key negotiator Mohammad Khalibaf has dismissed the economic pressure campaign.
Our dear people should be aware that there is only one solution to confronting this new conspiracy of the enemy: maintaining unity.
On Thursday, an official from the US State Department said Washington was launching an international coalition to restart shipping in the strait. In the meantime, further talks to secure a permanent end to the war remain elusive.
Well, for more, we're joined now by mediator Oliver McTernan, director and co-founder of Forward Thinking. Oliver, thanks so much for being with us on the programme as ever. You spent more than 2 decades working in conflict resolution in the Middle East and elsewhere. How can this current impasse be broken, in your view?
Very, very difficult question to answer. I think what we have is a clash of motives and aims. Both Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu are facing elections very soon. Trump, the midterm, Netanyahu, national elections. Now, I think Trump wants to come out of this as soon as possible as a winner. Netanyahu, on the other hand, needs to keep this war going because he has, I think, about 73% support for it in his country at the moment. So I think that in itself is a difficulty, and it's difficult to judge what impacts Netanyahu's needs and opinions will have on Trump. On the other hand, you've got the Iranians determined not to be humiliated. I was listening yesterday, in fact, to an Iranian academic who said, you know, Iran is not an object to play with, it's an actor. And I would just add to that, it's a very proud actor, where keeping one's dignity and avoiding humiliation is so important to them culturally.
And Oliver, we had tough words from the Iranian regime again today. This comes as US Central Command reportedly has prepared a plan for a wave of short and powerful strikes, as they're being described, to try to break this deadlock. Is Donald Trump likely to take this option, and how do you think Iran would respond if he does?
Well, I think they will not capitulate. And I think that's the very, very clear message. I think there was a miscalculation in rushing into what is, in effect, an illicit aggression against Iran. And now we're seeing the consequences. They seem to have the upper hand economically in the sense that it is having a global impact, and we're feeling that. But I think they will be able to, in some way, withstand the pressures that Trump and Netanyahu are putting on them, simply because, as I said, you know, they will avoid humiliation, even if it means, putting their own security at risk. It's a very proud, old civilization, Iran, and we can't lose sight of that. So it's, I think there will be a real stubbornness. I think Trump will have to find a more diplomatic way of defusing the current standoff.
And Pakistan, of course, saying it's still facilitating indirect talks between the two. What hope is there at this point for them actually to come back to the negotiating table? And are either side willing to actually compromise here, Oliver?
Well, I think Pakistan, first of all, has a very important role to play. Its geopolitical position is very important. It's got a good relationship with Iran, and we're led to believe a good relationship, at least the head of the military, with Donald Trump. So that is important. The trouble is that if the two mediators that Trump has appointed, Witkoff and Kushner, if they are playing a lead role again, I fear we won't make much progress, because last week the New York Times had an article in which it claimed that both of them proved themselves to be incompetent in dealing with the complexities of the issue. Now, the sticking point, of course, for Trump is telling us is Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. Well, Trump should recall that when he came into power, Iran had already signed an agreement, the JCPOA in 2015, and the reason for that agreement was based on a fatwa saying that Iran had no intention of developing nuclear weapons because they're founded on Islamic. I think that still holds. I was there in November. We were a part of a discussion where they admitted openly that there are some now arguing that for defense reasons, after their experience in June, they need a nuclear deterrent, whereas others were saying, no, firmly, the fatwa still stands. So it is an issue of, I think, agreement can be reached on that. The important thing for them, of course, is lifting the sanctions. And I think the Strait of Hormuz standoff will be something that they will reach agreement on. I think it's rightly unacceptable to expect the international community to pay tariffs going through international waters. So I think that is somewhere where they can climb down, as it were, without facing any sort of humiliation or looking a loser in this negotiation.
And do you think that Donald Trump will succeed then in getting other nations to help the US get the strait back up and running again?
It's very difficult to answer that. What worries me deeply is the impact of this war. Now, we're beginning to see the economic impact, higher food prices, higher oil prices at the pumps. But more seriously, I think, is the fact that there has been a total disregard for what I would say the legal and moral norms that have governed international relationships since the end of the Second World War. We're going back to the end of the 40s. Now, I think we're in a very, very dangerous space as an international community, and that's what should be worrying us. And I think to try and impose new rules through military process is not going to help. I think we need to get the region together, Europe together, and America, and really discuss a diplomatic way out of this.
And Oliver, even if Iran does ultimately drop this threat to retain control over the waterway, can it be trusted in the future not to close it again if it's in its interest to do so, even if this is something that will be covered in any eventual peace deal between the two?
Well, I think this is one of the unintended consequences, you might say, of launching an impulsive war, a war of choice. I don't think Iran even realized what a tool it had in controlling the straits and how it could impact immediately on the global economic affairs. And we see in the markets that reflected too. But that said, I think Iran needs to move on. In the discussions we used to have between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Europe, they were very anxious to see sanctions lifted to restore relationships with Western countries and actually to move on. And I think that's where they were. certainly in 2018, when Donald Trump decided to pull out of the JCPOA. And I think that's where many of the diplomats that I have contact with still are. So I think we should work on that. There are reasonable strategic thinkers in Iran, see their future in good relationships with the West, and I think we should try and build on that, and rather these threats of high explosives and damage, and threats that in fact go against the Geneva Conventions because they're going to hit civilian needed targets.
And Oliver, even if the war were to end this week, which seems highly unlikely currently, what will it take for shipping to return to normal, for confidence to return?
Well, that's a very good question, because, ship owners, insurers, all of them will be nervous. But I think it will depend very much on the way an agreement is reached. I think if it's a question of trying to force through a quick solution, then I think there will be a nervousness among shipping companies, because who wants to go through waters that you have to be protected by naval ships and aircraft? I think very few companies would make that choice.
And Oliver, how effective do we know has the US blockade of Iranian ports been? Is it succeeding in preventing Tehran from selling its oil? What do we know about that?
Well, we understand that it's not just the oil being sold, but it's also the fact that they can't import certain things that they need for their economy. And of course, that will have an impact. But as I said earlier, what I've learned about the Iranians in the time that I've been engaged in discussions with them, they are a very, very proud people. And they would much prefer to suffer bodily discomfort and even personal security than lose that sense of dignity. And I think that's misunderstood in the Trump administration and certainly in Israel.
Oliver, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you as ever for that analysis and insight. That's Oliver McTernan, Director and Co-founder of Forward Thinking.